quantum computers. This is Intelligent Performance.
Welcome to the Intelligent Performance Podcast. An absolute pleasure to have you with us, where we are fanatical about excellence in human endeavour. And today we welcome Nathan Murphy, a political thinker, a serial entrepreneur, and someone who's spent a lot of time going deep on what does it take to develop a phenomenal political system. So Nathan, first of all, thank you so much for joining us and calling in from beautiful Spain this morning.
Thank you very much. Here it is morning, but it's midnight, so just staying up late. So thank you, but I really appreciate it, and it's fantastic to be on your podcast, Michael.
Good on you. Well, I really appreciate you doing that. And sorry, your lighting is so impressive in the background. It looks like it might be, a beautiful morning coming through the curtains. So my mistake there, Nathan. So let's try and keep you awake for this one, given the time. So. Nathan, in terms of, there's a lot of political stuff going on at the moment, and in terms of this podcast, the Intelligent Performance, we're always very curious about the counterintuitive thinking. So just before we dive into something kind of a bit more broad around your area of expertise, I'm curious, what would be your take on the phrase intelligent performance?
I guess intelligent performance, in my mind, would be like an amplification of what you're doing. So I had a friend who's a CA, like a really long-term CA, and he says the aim of an entrepreneur is to do like 10 times as much in the same amount of time. So it's about leveraging your skills, your abilities, outsourcing, or putting in systems that can amplify the work that you're doing to get further along the road of whatever goal you're trying to do.
I love that. So I think leverage is a underutilized word, but kind of beautifully describes the world of an entrepreneur, right? It's kind of like, how do you get ahead with the same amount of hours and time that everyone else has got? So yeah, very, very cool. So Nathan, in terms of, maybe that translates into what we're going to talk about next. So you have recently released a book, and forgive me, I'm just putting up the title here, and it's the ideas that rule us. And it's a really interesting take on having a look at the political system that we all live within. Curious for you, we're in the time of the Trump and the Harris we've got about 4 weeks to go until the actual election takes place in the US. We've seen a recent Labour government appointed in the UK. Major riots broke out in the following weeks. We've seen interesting characters like Jordan Peterson get into interview things like Tommy Robinson, a far right-wing character, and kind of his ideas and perspectives becoming more popularized. So I'm curious, what's going on from from this political theory side? What are you starting to see across these general themes and general kind of political environments?
Yeah, so I think what's driving this wave of populism, if we can call it that, or maybe the rise of the right or far right politicians and organizations, I think underlying it are a few failures in the way we run our societies. And the result of those failures is that it creates instability within our political systems. So one area, for example, I think in the US, the fundamental problem is the system is largely corrupted by money. Ever since they had Citizens United, and sometime before that, in fairness, you have massive amounts of money go into elections. People can elect who they want, but then corporate, big business, wealthy people are dictating the policy. And the end result of that is, the bottom 50% of society is earning much, much less, and the top 10% is getting basically everything. And we're under that. People know that things have got worse. They want solutions. The solutions aren't within the existing parties. Democracy isn't delivering them in the way that they hope democracy will be delivering. And then they're susceptible to people who will give them, answers which are very simple, but the people who are giving those answers, which are very simple, are also really unlikely to deliver something that they actually want out of it at the end. So I think that's one fundamental issue, is like the failure, especially for like middle and lower classes. I think the other aspect, which is particularly pertinent in Europe, is the rise of like significant levels of immigration, and there's a lot to unpack within that, but the bottom line is that we're a group-based species. We like to feel that we are in a group, and we want to share with resources within our group, and we want that group to be defined. And when we feel like our group is being poorly defined, then it gives rise to quite a visceral feeling of cultural concern. That if your economy is bad, then it's economic concern because you're competing with jobs and people feel really angsty about that. But in a lot of the countries in Europe where we've had the rise of the far right, the economy is quite good, the jobs are quite good. You have a rise of like cultural concern. People are concerned about the change in their society, and they lean towards people who define those borders more harshly, and they happen to be people who are the far right. And that's given them a massive bonus. The AfD in Germany called the rise of Syrian refugees who come from a culture which is far more culturally distant than the other internal European immigration, which to Germany was like 1 million a year for 10 years up until the Syrian war. And then they had 800,000 Syrians come in. And for the FD, that was like the Christmas present. Literally their leader said, this is like Christmas come, my birthday all at once. Like they just suddenly got a huge raise in votes. And these European surveys showing that in Germany, like immigration as a concern leapt to being like the most important issue for something like 85% of the population. Wow. So not thinking about this, not managing immigration and not understanding the reality of this part of human nature has also led to people leaning towards populist parties who are generally fundamentally a little bit undemocratic. And again, that builds in problems with the political system or instability.
Is it that the left don't value closed borders, or they're just so, I think some might say, they're so woke that it's become, they're not even sure what they stand for, or they're so like they can't even define what a woman is or a man is. Like it's all become so like tricky because it's so like, oh, we don't offend anyone. Is it more because it's one thing to say it's the rise of the right and the kind of this strong view, but is it perhaps a failure of the left too, that they don't have they can't seem to form that strong perspective?
So to discuss this, I'd like to just talk about like a core piece of theory which we've developed within my organization, Prepolitica, and it's looking at the political spectrum, but not in the sense of like a policy. Like the right like these policies and the left like these policies, because it's so intermixed, it's so complicated, and in different places you have different things in different times. It doesn't work. There is no political spectrum of policy. But what you do have in general from the left to the right in like the Western version of it is you tend to have like a group preference. So on the right, they tend to prefer a group boundary preference. On the right, they prefer to have closed group boundaries or smaller group boundaries. And the group boundary is who you share your resources with. And the key resources or key elements for society are cooperation, fairness, and care. And within these group boundaries, and there's obviously like different concentric rings within a society, and the elites at the middle will have all of the benefits. But if you take the general group, the right tend to want to define stronger group boundaries, whereas the left see any group boundary as being fundamentally immoral because it goes against the core concept of moral equality, where everyone is equal in any form. So people on the very far left will say we should get rid of every single national border because it's immoral to discriminate against one person who was born 1 mile over the border and someone who wasn't. And on a fundamental basis, the left are right. That is, on a fundamental basis, not fair. But that's not the nature of humanity. We're a group-based species. We exist in groups. This is what we prefer. So you could open all borders. You could have every single poor person in the world come into your country. But all that's going to do for the left is it's going to erode their constituency. They're not going to be able to get into power, and they're not going to serve the other policies that the left can bring to the table, which are good for the people. And it's going to lean to the right or the conservatives who might actually cut the benefits and, cramp down on the rights of gay people or, abortion, or all of these things. And that's the fundamental thing. That's the tug of war that's happening underneath all politics. The right want to define boundaries more tightly, which to do so, you have to make up stories. So one story might be, well, we're a nation and we have these borders. Another one might be, well, these guys are like, lazy and poor, and that's why we don't want to give them, the core benefits of society. It's for people who are hardworking and good. And they have to lean into narratives. That's why the right often feels a little, like comes across as a little bit evil, because they have to do sort of cool things to implement their agenda. Whereas the left, in a sort of naive sense, they believe that they can break down all boundaries, but that makes people feel like uncomfortable because we want group boundaries. And then we lean towards people who define it, and then we go back to the right. So I don't know if that makes sense to you, or if anything that chimes with your experience. Or
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think absolutely. Like I left uni as a like a hardcore lefty, and I swallowed that kind of green ideology without questioning it. I grew up in a Labour family as well, so kind of like that was just everyone should just hate Margaret Thatcher, right? And it was then it was only since getting into business where it just becomes actually, mate, hang on a second, like hang on, and you start to unpack and challenge and kind of perhaps I just came to the party very late. I'm not sure, but my mid-20s was a real awakening, and I think going forward as you go down a business rabbit hole or you become a higher income earner, you start to perhaps question different things and you see things in a different way, especially when people like yourself have gone on this entrepreneurial journey. So let's just step back to that briefly for yourself. So you've done multiple startups, exited, you now live in beautiful Spain. You worked as a lobbyist, and now you've kind of reinvented yourself. Well, you had a bit of a renovation in there as well. We can touch on that too. But now you're this kind of, and I really like this because if we look back historically, I look back to the four founders of the country. I live in Australia. Like the local butcher also was an electrician, was also ran for government, and also was like really involved in the church and philosophy. Like they had many dimensions to their personality. They weren't just an electrician, as an example, right? And I feel like you're more classic in terms of your background and understanding. So, in terms of your journey, just briefly, tell us a bit more about how that's progressed for you, and perhaps how that's kind of informed the work you're doing, and why you feel like political theory is perhaps such an interesting one and requires such a focus.
Yeah, so I studied industrial design at university, and to be honest, I was quite good at it. And then I invented a medical product, which I basically patented, and then I sold it as a piece of IP. And then admittedly, I went on holiday for quite a long time because I was a student, basically just post-university sort of thing. And then I came back and I worked for GlaxoSmithKline for a year. And then literally just then to save money, I was doing like future concept, like generation stuff. And I literally just saved money, started a business. And my first business was like, not good, but we scraped through, and then sort of just got like smashed by the 2008 recession. Which was like, devastated business. And we went from having like, 500K in revenue lined up to basically like 30. And we had like a team in Malaysia, a team in the UK. And we're like, right, what do we do? Shifted into like, just directly shifted into software as a service products. I did that for a number of years. And then I moved my company to a corporate, worked for them for a couple of years. But while I was doing that business, I also did like this quite big project on prison and prison system design. Because I think if there's like any strength I have, it's like this system thinking, taking complicated things and trying to make them like understandable. So I did this, and I like presented in the House of Lords, like lobbied the highest levels of governments, had like all this stuff going on, and like sponsored prison design conferences and spoke at them. It was like a kind of a wild thing for someone in mid-20s. But what that taught me was like, you could go and protest about something, right? And you're like just someone on the protest. But what politicians need is solutions. Like you get a politician who's dumped into a senior role. Now they're in charge of prisons, and they've got every single advocacy group. Like, well, we're the prison education trust, right? And okay, you're going to come and meet these people, and what they're going to say? Oh, we need more education in prisons. How are we going to do that? And he's like, well, there's no money. So what I was coming with is like a holistic system, like changes. Like this is how you can reimagine the system in a way which would be like palatable for the right-wing newspapers. Palatable basically for your electorate, but it will actually give you that like the real beneficial change, because it doesn't matter, like you didn't have to have people in like Sweden style hotels, but you do need to do something with that individual while they're in that space. So basically what I realized in that project is I could go from like basically a nobody, just graft hard for a couple of years, do all the research. I visited prisons, spoke to chief inspectors of prisons, did like CEOs of prison build companies, psychology, all of this, just major like deep dive, create solutions, and then go to politicians and say, hey, look, I've got no skin in the game. I'm not trying to persuade you about anything. We're a group. We've thought of these ideas. Here's the ideas. They're yours for free. And they gratefully receive them. And what that taught me, I think, from a perspective of like effective politics is if you come with good ideas and you're not trying to like leverage something in your favor, people are pretty receptive. And that was like, that really stuck with me. Like I dropped that project after a while. Some sort of stuff trickled into law, but it was just like eradicated by the wash of parliamentary stuff. But like, and I almost got back involved in prisons because they were going to do this huge like investment in prison estate, which is really, really overdue. But then essentially Brexit came and it's basically stopped anything like big in the budget. So that was basically out the window. But I put that aside because I was like, okay, if I really want to make a difference in this area, it's such a long, it's like a 20, 30 year like slog. And it's like, well, maybe this isn't like my long-term fight. And then I went off, did business, I spent a few years like focusing on like climbing, become a sponsor climber, did like, fantastic time. And then during that time, I had a lot of questions. And one of the fundamental questions I had was, I charged into business like straight, like hot out of the gates of university. Because I was like, I'm going to make a business, I'm going to grow a thing, going to get rich, right? I mean, like grow a business, but get rich was like the sideline, right? I'm going to be rich. Yeah. And like, and Charge had done that. And I didn't consider myself as like especially amazing entrepreneur, but like I charged into this thing and it's sort of like late 20s. I was like, but is this really what I like? Is this really who I am and what I want? And I kind of also realized I didn't care that much about money, but I was driving a lot of time towards money. So these questions arise like, why do I make the decisions I make? And especially when there's so many other options that we can do in our lives. And that's it. So to answer that question, you've got to look at your socialization. Like, how were you brought up? Like I was born in the 80s, right? And in that time, money was the thing, like flashy stuff. Like the 80s, I mean, we're not far apart in age, right? 80s was like a major, like, it was all about the money, like the flashy stuff and being a millionaire. Like being a millionaire was like pretty much a catchphrase in TV shows, right? And that's that. And like I think when I was young, although my dad was a teacher, they weren't about the money, but the cultural environment was unescapable in my mind. I'm like, I mean, I don't like having a boss. That's part of it, but at the same time, in my mind, I'm like, just get rich. That's like clearly the answer. That's clearly success. That's what success is. That's the value I learned. But then over time, now I can unpack that. And I think, well, is that actually success? Is that really what I want? Is this what I want to work for? And I could see it in some of the businesses I was doing. I just had like, it was going quite well, but I had like really low motivation to do the day-to-day grind. I'm like, why am I so lazy? And it just kind of like, where the ideas took me weren't necessarily where I should have been in the long run. I mean, I had to go through the journey. So that really made me think about socialization. You can't think about socialization without starting to get stuck into ideas. And as soon as you're looking at ideas, then you're looking at like the broader society. And then I got really interested in how do ideas change? Like, how do you break down an ideology and use that to understand how you would strategically change something? And then I was looking at, okay, well, how long do ideas take to change? So I did a bunch of studies on how long big ideologies have taken to go from like 95% of adherence to like 5%. So things like approval of interracial marriage in the US, and approval of homosexuality in the UK, or smoking, or drink driving, things like that. And all of these things started to come together and started to coalesce into this. Okay, here's like a whole piece of political theory and understanding that just isn't out there. And I think it could be useful for activists. It could be useful for anyone who's interested in changing their social environment. But it also, when you really look at the science of human biological behavior, there's also some things that are like, not the best things about humans. Our group-based, the fact that empathy, we can turn it off when we're talking about other people or people who we dehumanize. Like there's a dark side to humanity. But again, if you don't understand these things, then you can't sort of prepare for them. You can't build them in to our systems. So I've just talked for a really long time.
I love it. There's heaps in there. So I want to touch on the prison side, because I think the actual, it's a useful, that was your kind of first exposure to these really, as you say, big, but yeah, because it's a political issue, right? Prisons, as much as it's a sort of societal construct, and then also the treatment of prisoners, as an example, is kind of politically, tricky as well. Like, it's one you want to get right. You need to, as you say, satisfy your electorate that you're being tough on crime, and not a pushover. But equally, you've got to, that comes at a cost, right? And so, in terms of, I'm curious on that project, especially given how it kind of came unceremoniously to an end, like with Brexit, where it didn't really get anywhere. Like, I'm curious on like how you stay motivated in that, because you also got to see the realities of these 20, 30-year projects where they actually they don't happen sometimes, and that's
Really
kind of
hard.
like, yeah, really tough, especially to monetize, right? And I'm curious, like, fine for a government, not great for an entrepreneur. Like,
I mean, that project was a bonfire of money. Like
yeah,
I had like
yeah,
guys doing like renderings. It was just fun. I just fund this stuff out of the business, right? It just basically was another line in my business expense,
right,
and that's fine because I mean, I use business to like to make money, create freedom, and from the freedom, then I can do interesting and meaningful projects, right? If my business was only ever just to make money, I think I'd struggle. But if my
yeah,
business, the meaning of my business is to deliver me freedom, freedom to pursue things that are important to me, then I get like ruthless about it. I hire people. I make sure that like I reduce the workload I need to put into it. I enable myself to have that free time rather than just let the business absorb me. And honestly, that like often that will mean that I make less money because obviously if you focus on your business all the time, you make more money. But then again, if I'm trading interest in for money too much, my life will become boring. So it's like there's a balance there.
Yeah. So it's almost like this, the ideas that rule us is almost like the ideas that rule Nathan, in many ways. And that's kind of being and kind of challenging yourself on that piece, right? In terms of, I think that is an interesting thing, right? I remember I grew up in a place called Dawlish, which we've kind of touched on just before we jumped on. And my neighbours opposite had a BMW the whole time I was there. And it never really clunked in my head that there's a reason why we drive a Toyota and they drive a Beamer. You know, like it was like, and they ran the fish and chip shop. They had the better ocean view, and you know, like it was just all these. I just never really got it. So, in terms of the ideas that rule us, let's talk about that more broadly at a political level. You talked about populism, far right. Are these out of date ideas that you're seeing coming through? And I'm curious as to if you've spent 5 years looking at this, like what's the alternative too? Like it sounds like this is pretty standard in terms of the group. What do you call it? The group, we're a group based species, right?
Yeah.
So in terms of that quote unquote the ideas, is your kind of premise that they're out of date or we need to kind of upgrade them, as it were?
In terms of the ideas that behind society, or
I'm curious. Like, you know, you spent 5 years or so, whatever time, looking at the prisons and going, here's a new playbook, as it were. And what's the take on political parties more broadly? I know it's a massive question in terms of like the Western world. Like, so what's
it is fundamentally relevant to the projects that I'm working on. I think in a really broad sense, one of the problems we have is a lot of our foundational political thinking has been developed in like the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th century. So you have philosophers who were observing the world around them within what they could understand of it, and then they're making their theories about it or using their imagination to create theories. And no doubt these are really smart people, but they had basically none or very, very little science to base their thinking on. So when they're trying to determine what is the nature of humans, so, you know, you've got Thomas Hobbes, and humans are nasty, brutish, and selfish. And then Rousseau with a different argument. They're just based on their imaginations or what they see in the time. You know, Hobbes thinks you should have a central authority who needs to tell people what to do, and the institutions control people. And if you believe that, and if that's your model, then yeah, you need like a strong police state to keep people in their place. Whereas if that's not true, then you've just been applying a lot of force on people for absolutely no reason, and people don't like force, right? So what I'd like to see is coming back. Let's look at behavioral biology, everything we know in behavioral biology about people, and in neuroscience, in sociology, in psychology. Bring all this stuff together and build a political theory based on that. And largely that's the fundamental, like, long-term project of what we're working on. And it's trying to understand, you know, what are the fundamental properties of a society, and what is the purpose of society? What are we aiming towards? You know, surely society isn't about making some people as absolutely rich as possible and everyone else to be a bit impoverished. That's obviously not the aim of society. And all of these answers come in our biology, because we've evolved characteristics and innate biases towards certain things. And I argue that it's towards that caring is better than uncaring, fairness is better than unfairness, and cooperation is better than non-cooperation. We have complicated things like, well, aggression, but aggression's bimodal, and we can talk about that later if you want. But it's if you understand that these are the fundamental three things that society needs to provide for everyone within the group, and understand that we also have to respect group boundaries. So within group boundaries, you should try and create a fair society. And this comes back to what we talked about earlier. Fairness is not equality. And I think this is one of the fundamental problems with a lot of like leftist thinking is equality is the abstract version of fairness. Fairness is an emotion, right? We have an innate preference for fairness. If you get a child and you dish out food and one of their friends gets hardly any, people they'll feel uncomfortable. You'll feel uncomfortable. You want to like correct the unfairness. This is something which we have innately in us. It's heritable trait. We know this. And whereas equality is like the mathematical abstraction of it, which works well with bureaucracy. So it's like 1 + 1. The communist idea of equality doesn't work because we don't have a preference for equality. We have a biological preference for fairness. And that's what we need to be focused on, fairness. And fairness is difficult to deliver because it's contextual. It depends on people's situations, and it doesn't work very well with large scale bureaucracy. But we've got to move away from this like pure focus on equality. Fairness is what people actually want. And if you try to deliver equality, it doesn't necessarily doesn't sit well with people in the long run, especially if you go to the more extreme expressions.
And we saw that in the Olympics, right, with the boxing as an example.
So I mean, okay, so like the trans thing, and you could also apply it to many other areas. This is another area of the left and its potential overreach. I'm not an expert in this stuff, so hopefully people don't start lynching me on the internet. But we've got group boundaries, and within group boundaries, other group boundaries, and one of the group boundaries traditionally has been like gender or sex, right? I'm going to get the terms confused for the right terminology. So you have two separate genders, male and female, and this is a group boundary that elements of the left want to deconstruct. They want to say there are no group boundaries there. I suspect on a biological level, I mean, there aren't many like biologically given group boundaries, right? You have like species and probably sex. There's not many other group boundaries. Like we can't breed with another species. We are the human species, our genus, right? And then you have sex. And to deconstruct sex, I might be pushing it too far. And the thing is, because potentially it's a group boundary too far for the left to deconstruct, the right are having a field day because there's a group boundary that they don't have to make up a myth to defend.
Makes sense. Yeah, it's a very interesting one. There's a court case down here, which it's hard to take seriously because the two parties, one was called Tickle and one was called Giggle, and it is and it's
that's very Aussie.
It's hard to believe that those were actually the parties. And Tickle was contesting Giggle on the right for there to be a women's only group on Facebook, where women who had encountered domestic violence, they could stay in this group and be in a safe environment. And this chap who appreciated he thought it was a woman. He felt that was discriminatory, and it's a very interesting, if you look at that as from a political perspective and about how these kind of left and right ideals kind of play out, and it almost kind of feels. What's also interesting, I think, is that even to talk about these issues these days become contentious. You know what I mean? Like it's it's the inference that if you're talking about it, then you kind of disagree, and also disagreement. I think that's what's interesting about Vivek Ramaswamy over in the US. He seems to be very pro, and I'm curious on your take on him in terms of that political theory piece, because he seems to be very kind of old school in terms of trying to elicit conversation or discussion, and very brave discussion. I think he invites protesters into his things, into his meetings, into his speeches. He's very open on his views on abortion and climate change and so forth, but open equally to the expression of democracy. And I think perhaps I'd love to hear your take on that, because Trump and Harris are both talking about how democracy is at stake here, which seems to get talked about at every election. But this one apparently more important than ever. So tell us, what's your take on that in terms of how does that relate to the political theory that was kind of playing out?
So going back to the start, I guess with this sort of trans thing, I think sometimes, and it's similar probably with immigration, probably with immigration and the trans thing, there is no pure perfect answer. When they're talking about drugs for children to transition before they're adults, well, if you give them the option to use the drugs without parents' permission or whatever the plan was, then some will grow up to regret it. And if you don't, some will grow up to feel regret as well. There's just no good answer. It's really tough. It's a really tough one. I don't, I have sympathy with both sides of the argument, and I don't think there is no perfect answer. And with immigration as well, like the people who are trying to escape like desperate, horrible situations, to go to new places where they can live a better life for them and their families, or to earn money to send back to their family and save them from desperate poverty. Like, completely understand it. And probably if I was in the situation and I could do that for my family, I would be doing the same thing. I'd be dying on a boat in the Channel. But you can't also accept vast numbers of refugees or immigrants or whatever into your country without creating cultural concern. Then you lean to the right. Then you have populist expressions of power. Populists don't tend to be very good actually at leading and governing and getting things done, because they're more hot air than actual substance, and they tend to be highly corruptible, and often they end up with very right-wing expressions, which means many people at the bottom of society suffer the results, and often they move into like slightly more like corporatist expressions of governance. So there's no good answer there. Like, we have to accept sometimes there's no good answers, and then you want to lead towards what's the most compassionate answer we can do. Like, if you can't have this like emotionally intensive care where you bring everyone into your country, well, you can sure as hell chuck a lot of money at the neighboring country to try and help them deliver care, or people who are more culturally close to those people, to reduce this problem. So that's one thing. And what was the other one? I lost myself.
That's right. I'm not sure how I bridged it, but we got straight into Vivek Ramaswamy in terms of the kind of capturing the ideas, and even the fact that he's been able to get his name to be pronounceable by a bunch of Americans is a feat in its own. But it's interesting how he seems to be positioning himself for not this election, but very much the next one, and I think that's very, very obvious, and it's also very interesting, I think, because it's like who is the leader post Trump, right? If he does get elected, and I think the Republicans have got a major challenge with that, because it's become this, he's become such a central figure. That's right, and it's like, and there's a real abyss, shall we say, or kind of like a cavity which needs to be filled, and I'm not sure if you would agree on that, but Vivek, in my take, is that kind of trying to claim that territory by coming out, running for election, being the first to drop out, endorsing Trump, saying, yeah, it's cool, like, okay, I'm with him, and now I'm going to pump my message and kind of my profile. But I'm curious, it was more around what Vivek seems to be more pro on is his ideas and collect his, trying to capture and almost re-empower this ability to discuss ideas, because that kind of speaks to that fairness piece, in that how you arrive at a fair solution if you can't talk about stuff, right? And if you can't actually say, I think this, I think that, and then what is your take on kind of more
on the discussion and the debate? I think that this also comes back to this sort of group boundary definition, the spectrum of preference, because even though the strong leftist people are want to destroy these group boundaries, they have like a preference towards open group boundaries, they still have the preference for group boundary, if that makes sense. But the only moral group boundary you can define if you're a hard moral quality leftist is one of moral purity. That's why, you get this like crazy far left lynching of people who are basically already really quite left wing and delivering on the left wing message because they say something wrong. This hard group boundary of moral purity is really problematic with the left, because it leads to choosing fighting and makes them less effective, right? But it's an instinct, because we all want to define a group. And if you can't base your group on your nation or your tradition or your culture or whatever it is you want to label as the thing that makes you Australian or British or whatever, then the only thing you can really do it is on your values. And if you're going to draw a tight boundary and you're going to say you're in and you're out, then those boundaries tend to lean to these sort of moral purity positions. And that stifles debate because, you know, people on the right who might have quite valid viewpoints will be like shuttered down and told that they're like a racist bigot because they want to reduce immigration. And by doing that, they're actually doing a huge amount of damage, because if you tell people whose primary concern about immigration is not that they're racist, they didn't really have a problem with people like from other countries or cultures or traditions or whatever, but they have a cultural concern that their community changes and they're losing their sense of identity of their group. If you tell them that they're racist, then you're conflating two things, which one is real. Culture is real, it's demonstrable real. We have different cultural traditions, different dresses, different attitudes. And the other one is race, which is a completely made up human concept. There's no such thing as race. There are people with different skin melanin, like content or whatever, but then there's no way you can draw a line to say, oh, you're black, you're white. It's complete spectrum. So there is no such thing as like a race. A race is a human construct. And if you conflate the two and say, well, you know, you're concerned about culture, therefore you're racist. And then they'll be like, well, maybe I'm racist. And you're giving credence to a really, really horrible idea that, you know, the contents of your mind are determined by the color of your skin. And that's also a problem, which, you know, people like moral relatives on the left are also problematic in that term, where they say, well, all cultures are equal. You should never criticize another culture. Well, I would strongly disagree with that. You know, the cultures that see like girls to be less valuable than boys, which means like, you know, tens of thousands of girls are born every year, born and then killed because they don't want a girl, they want a boy. Or, you know, no education for girls because, well, they're female. Or, you know, all of these things, these are not good. And I don't care like how academic you make that debate. Some cultural ideas are worse than others. And this is also like detrimental, I think, to some leftist ideas or some leftist I don't know, movements.
Yeah, so what's the way forward here then? I want to bring in your book here. So the ideas that rule us, it certainly sounds like when we all take a step back and start to reflect, there are rules, there's ideologies, there's philosophies, I guess you could call it, that we've all adopted, right? I've been thinking about religion quite recently in terms of a lot of people say, I'm not religious. And then they're like, okay, well, what do you serve? Or who is your God? You know, I think I don't believe in God. Okay, well, but do you turn up to work for money? You know, or do you chase money? Like, it's almost like money is their God or they are their own God. And I thought that's an interesting, it can be quite hard to reflect on the beliefs that maybe appear so like, just are, you know what I mean? They're not even a belief. They're just
the background noise. The background noise of ideological environment. That's a real thing. It's so, you know, gone.
No, I really don't have much of a question. More like I'm kind of like grasping at straws here in terms of like I'm getting way out of my depth. So I'm hoping you can jump in. But I'm curious. Your tagline here is how other people's ideas rule our lives and how to change it. So I'm curious about that last bit, how to change it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think as we grow up, like your socialization is pretty much a long process of embedding you with values, and a very quite deep basis, which will be held subconsciously, which affect your behavior. And you move out into the world as an adolescent or young adult, and you're working towards the sort of value systems that you've grown up to they've been embodied within you. These ideas have affected, you know, your worldview. And as you move through your life, you might find that these don't necessarily add up to, you know, feeling fulfilled or the right thing for you to do in your life. And I think what we can do with that is we can look at our values. And if you can't write down your values, then you can look at like how you behave. because your behavior always communicates values, not necessarily words, right? And this is the truth of all human behavior. So you can look at what you do and what you say and what makes sense. Because you got on a freight ship or something not to fly when you're young, right? That behavior communicates a pretty well held value. Now, I could say, well, I'm an environmentalist, but in a month's time, I'm going to fly to Nepal, right? Am I? No, not that much. That communicates a value. But we can look at what we do, how we behave, and the values we hold, and then we can sort of try and unpack them and try and determine whether they're working for us or not. And I know this is super broad. I mean, I guess a lot of this will come into sort of like psychoanalytic stuff. But for example, some people will grow up with the idea that they're not worthy, and will charge their entire life down this route to try and prove their worth by having more things or, pleasing people or whatever it is. And if you can pin down some of these, maybe these deeper emotional values, or maybe the more like goals or success-based values, and try and understand what they are, like what am I valuing, what am I working towards? And then you can determine, is that actually good for me? Is that really who I am? Is that really what I want? And if it's not, you have the opportunity to try and change it. And the best way to change it is through behavior, because it's not an overnight thing in general to change like quite closely held ideas. Like, we're all a little bit consumeristic. I constantly fight against like the consumeristic urges. I'm not like, didn't grow up in a super consumeristic environment, but I do have that feeling sometimes, and I've got to like nip it in the bud. Like I sometimes think, I'm going to work really, really hard and I'm going to make shitloads of cash now, right? I'm just going to go for it, just like bang, retire. But like, that's like an urge to like financial wealth. It's not probably not going to make me happy. And I could actually try, and I might just sort of just like peter out after a while and beat myself up being lazy and not sticking to my plan, because it's not attached to like the deeper values I have.
Yeah, I think anyone who can kind of spend 5 years going deep on political theory and can do that under their own steam outside of university and with a view to be curious, I think it's awesome, Nathan. I think your story and your diligence around this topic and how you pick up on these different things, and you're willing to kind of like, go deep. And as you say, I like that whole experience about going deep on the prisons and about how anyone can become an expert. I think that's actually incredibly powerful. And if we were talking about, kind of link this back to intelligent performance, that's very much it, right? In terms of like, you don't have to be defined by who you were and where you came from. And actually there is a chance more broadly in understanding that actually in this world of capitalism, it's actually skill set, which wins the day, and kind of knowledge and value. That's the whole point. That's how it's kind of angled towards it. So yeah, I feel like your journey has been extraordinary in terms of that capacity. I'm curious, Nath, just given the time frame we've got, how can people reach you? Given I'm not dead curious about this book now, and I'm like, so yeah, what's the best way for people to reach you and to kind of follow more of your thinking, especially at Pre-Politica, right? In terms of the
so that's the political theory, like I guess it's like a philosophy tank. But otherwise, they can find me on njmurphy.com or Nathan J. Murphy on socials. And they can also find my book. There's someone else has started to publish a book. They haven't published yet, called The Ideas Are All It. So it looks like this one, if you're looking, this book. I've got the trademark. I've sent them like a legal letter, but I just like quietly ignoring it. I don't know why. Anyway, so it's called The Ideas That Rule Us. I think it's a book which is like, I'd pretty much be willing to say, if you bought the book and you didn't take something valuable from it, I'll give you money back. Because like, and also I'm selling it cheap because I want volume. But I genuinely think if you can understand the concepts of this book, it will add some real value to your life.
And specifically, it's around understanding, it sounds like yourself, but also society more broadly, right? In terms of,
Potentially.
Yeah.
The society, broad society thing, I mean, it's got a basis of theory there, but to turn it into a explicitly political project is another significant amount of work. I'm working on it. But again, like you said earlier, like to stop intelligent performance. And, you said, okay, I've done all this work outside of like the shelter of the university. But actually, I mean, I've been presenting at like political theory conferences, academic conferences. And then what you realize, it's a massive advantage not to be in a university, because I can outwork all of them because they have students, massive bureaucracy, tons of like admin. The amount of work they can do, actual deep work on for their project, is quite small. Whereas I can go for like 2 years and only work on one thing. They haven't got a chance to do that. So it's like finding another path if you want to get that result. I considered doing a PhD and then applied for them, but it just didn't make sense. It didn't make sense for what I wanted to achieve. Interesting.
That is really cool. That's we should have put that nugget right at the front. Wish you the best with the book launch and getting out there. And thanks for staying up so late. I really appreciate it. It's been awesome chatting to you.
No problem at all. Really appreciate being on your podcast, and it was a great chat.